Writing. The first scream came before sunrise. It tore through the cold mountain air like a warning from another world, and within seconds, the peaceful veterans' retreat became a scene of chaos. A tour bus carrying former soldiers had slid off the wet road and crashed into a ditch beside the forest. Glass covered the pavement. Smoke drifted upward. Men who had survived wars overseas now lay injured only miles from home. And in the middle of that terrible morning, while everyone froze in shock, one young woman ran toward the wreckage. She wore light blue medical scrubs. She was not a soldier. She carried no rank, no medals, no military history anyone knew about. Yet her hands moved with the speed and precision of someone who had seen disaster before. She tied tourniquets, stopped bleeding, checked breathing, and gave calm instructions while panic spread around her. The veterans watched in silence. Even Colonel Arthur Whitmore, a decorated officer who had spent 30 years in combat zones, stared at her with disbelief. Because the way she worked was not ordinary emergency care. It was battlefield medicine. Before we continue this emotional story, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel, Kindness Legacy, if you believe kindness, courage, and second chances can change lives. Your support helps us bring more heart-touching stories to people around the world. The young woman's name was Mara Holloway. At 32 years old, Mara lived a quiet life in the small town of Cedar Ridge. She worked as a nurse at a local clinic and spent most evenings caring for her elderly grandmother. To most people, she seemed gentle, reserved, almost invisible. She avoided attention and rarely spoke about her past. No one knew that every night, long after the town slept, memories still visited her. Memories she had spent years trying to bury. As the injured veterans lay on the roadside, Mara moved quickly from one person to another. One man had severe bleeding from his arm. Another struggled to breathe. A third was unconscious. Her face remained calm, but her eyes carried something deeper. Pain. Experience. Understanding. Colonel Whitmore watched her place pressure on a wound exactly the way military medics were trained. Then he saw her speak softly to an injured veteran suffering from shock. The words she used were familiar. Too familiar. They were the same words medics had spoken to frightened soldiers in combat zones thousands of miles away. The colonel felt something heavy settle in his chest. When emergency teams finally arrived, the worst had passed. Every injured person had survived. Doctors later said that without Mara's quick actions, several men would not have made it. As paramedics loaded patients into ambulances, Colonel Whitmore approached her. Mara stood alone near the forest edge, washing blood from her hands with water from a bottle. The colonel looked at her quietly. Then he asked the question no one else dared to ask. How did she know battlefield medicine? For a long moment, Mara said nothing. The mountains stood silent around them. The wind moved gently through the trees. And then, with eyes filled with old sorrow, she gave an answer that made every veteran nearby fall silent. Mara explained that 20 years earlier, when she was only 12 years old, her father had returned home from war. He had been a combat medic. He came back alive, but something inside him never returned. The nightmares followed him every night. Loud sounds made him tremble. Crowded places terrified him. The smiling father Mara remembered slowly disappeared, replaced by a man carrying invisible wounds no one could see. At that time, people did not talk openly about trauma. Many veterans suffered in silence. And Mara watched her father fight battles long after the war had ended. To help him, she learned. She sat beside him while he studied medical books. She listened to stories he never told anyone else. She practiced bandaging wounds with old supplies in the garage. Her father taught her everything he knew. Not because he wanted her to become a medic. But because teaching was the only time he felt peaceful. Those evenings became their sanctuary. Father and daughter. Healing each other without realizing it. Then one winter night, everything changed. Mara's father passed away suddenly from a heart condition. He was only 48 years old. And the world became quiet. Too quiet. For years afterward, Mara carried guilt in her heart. She wondered if she could have done more. Learned more. Saved him somehow. That pain led her to nursing school. It led her to hospitals, emergency rooms, and long nights caring for strangers. And every patient she helped felt like a small promise kept. A promise to the father who had taught her that saving one life mattered. When Mara finished speaking, the veterans around her stood motionless. Some lowered their heads. Others wiped tears from their eyes. Because they understood. Many of them had returned from wars carrying burdens too heavy to explain. And here stood a woman who had quietly carried those burdens too. Not on battlefields. But at home. The hidden battlefield of families. Colonel Whitmore looked at Mara for a long moment. Then, without a word, the old soldier stood straight and saluted her. One by one, other veterans followed. Men who had worn medals. Men who had survived combat. Men who rarely showed emotion. They saluted a nurse who had honored a father's memory through kindness. Mara's eyes filled with tears. Not because of the salute. But because, for the first time in years, she felt seen. Weeks passed. The story spread across the town. People spoke about the nurse who saved veterans after the crash. Yet Mara remained the same. Quiet. Humble. Working long shifts at the clinic. Caring for patients. Helping neighbors. But something had changed. The veterans began visiting the clinic more often. Not for medicine. For conversation. For understanding. Mara listened to stories of lost friends, difficult memories, and silent struggles. And in return, the veterans found something many had missed for years. Connection. A retired soldier started volunteering at a youth center. Another joined a support group. One man who had spent years isolated began speaking openly about trauma. Healing spread quietly, person by person. Kindness became a bridge. Months later, the town organized a ceremony to honor first responders and veterans. Hundreds gathered under warm daylight in the town square. Families sat together. Children waved flags. And Mara stood nervously near the stage. Colonel Whitmore stepped to the microphone. His voice, strong yet emotional, carried across the crowd. He spoke about courage. Not the courage seen in movies. But the quiet courage of people who choose compassion. He spoke about soldiers. About families. About invisible wounds. And then he spoke about Mara. A woman who had turned grief into service. Pain into healing. Loss into hope. By the end of his speech, many people were crying. Because everyone understood something important. Heroism does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears scrubs. Sometimes it sits beside someone in pain. Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it remembers. And sometimes it keeps a promise made long ago. If this story has touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Legacy. Your support helps spread stories of compassion, courage, and humanity to people who need them most. Special request, in memory of all veterans and families carrying invisible battles, please write, "Kindness Heals," in the comments below so their sacrifices are never forgotten. That evening, after the ceremony ended, Mara walked alone toward the hills outside town. The sky glowed orange as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the mountains. She carried a small photograph in her hand. A picture of her father. Young. Smiling. Wearing his medic uniform. Mara sat quietly beneath a tree and looked at the fading light. For years, she had believed grief was something to overcome. But now she understood. Grief was not something we leave behind. It becomes part of us. And when we choose kindness, service, and love, grief transforms. It becomes purpose. The wind moved softly through the trees. The mountains stood silent. And somewhere, in that peaceful moment, a daughter felt that her father's lessons had finally reached the world. The veterans he once served. The lives she had saved. The people who found hope again. All connected by one simple truth. Kindness is the greatest